Imagine waking up to discover that your local election has been canceled, not because of a national emergency or constitutional crisis, but because the government decided it would just be a bit inconvenient right now. 4 million people across England are about to live that reality in May when Labour pulls the plug on at least 27 council elections, leaving hundreds of councillors cozy in their seats without facing voters. We're talking elected representatives potentially serving 7-year terms without re-election, which is less democracy and more feudalism with better Wi-Fi. The Conservatives are furious. Reform UK is launching a judicial review, and even some Labour councillors are openly angry at their own government for what looks suspiciously like running scared of an electoral kicking. So let's dive into this absolute shambles of democratic accountability, figure out whether there's any legitimate justification for canceling elections, and explore why this might be one of the most politically toxic decisions Labour's made yet. Spoiler alert, it's not looking good. Right, let's start with the raw numbers because they're genuinely staggering. 4 million people denied the vote. Not in some distant authoritarian regime, not in a country with a dodgy democratic record. Right here in England in 2025. More than 20 councils have confirmed they're delaying elections, 3/4 of which are Labour-run, which is a hell of a coincidence if this is supposed to be about administrative necessity rather than political convenience. Another 7 Labour councils are expected to join them, bringing the total number of disenfranchised voters to 3.7 million. Some councils are canceling elections for the second year running, which means councillors elected in 2018 will have been in office for 7 years without facing voters again. 7 years! That's longer than most parliamentary terms. It's longer than some people's marriages. And it's happening because the government's decided democracy can wait. The mechanism being used is absolutely fascinating in how obscure it is. Keir Starmer's relying on a clause in the 2000 Local Government Act that gives ministers the power to delay votes. It's one of those bits of legislation that probably seemed reasonable at the time for genuine emergencies, but is now being weaponized for what looks like pure political calculation. The clause was meant for exceptional circumstances, the kind of once-in-a-generation situations where holding elections would genuinely be impossible or deeply problematic. Natural disasters, major constitutional upheaval, that sort of thing. It was not designed to be a get-out-of-jail-free card for governments worried about getting hammered at the polls. Labour's official justification is that councils are facing major restructuring, with some district councils being abolished and new mayoralties being introduced, so it makes sense to delay elections until the new structures are in place, which sounds vaguely reasonable until you think about it for more than 30 seconds. Councils get restructured all the time. Local government boundaries change. New administrative arrangements get introduced. Democracy doesn't stop just because bureaucracy gets complicated. If anything, periods of major change are exactly when you want democratic input and accountability, not less. Voters should get a say in who manages these transitions, not have their voice silenced because it's administratively tidier. The Electoral Commission, which is literally the independent watchdog for this stuff, has basically said this doesn't meet the threshold for exceptional circumstances that would justify postponement. When the independent experts whose entire job is overseeing elections say you're overstepping, that should be a massive red flag. But Labour's pushing ahead anyway, which suggests either they genuinely believe they know better than the Electoral Commission, or more likely they're just hoping the electoral damage from cancelling votes is less severe than the damage they take from actually holding elections and getting destroyed. James Cleverly's response is pure political gold for the Conservatives, because he gets to position them as defenders of democracy against Labour authoritarianism, which is quite the role reversal from some of their own questionable democratic practices over the years. But his core point is absolutely valid. It cannot be right that elected representatives serve 7-year terms without re-election. That's not how democracy works. Representatives derive their legitimacy from regular accountability to voters. When you remove that accountability, you fundamentally change the nature of the position. They're no longer serving at the pleasure of their constituents, they're just occupying a seat until someone eventually decides they should face judgment. Cleverly accusing Labour of running scared of the voters' verdict is almost certainly true. The polls for Labour are absolutely abysmal right now. They've hemorrhaged support since the election. Every decision seems to alienate another chunk of voters, and local elections in May would likely be a bloodbath. So from a purely cynical political perspective, canceling elections makes perfect sense. Why voluntarily walk into a beating when you can just postpone the whole thing and hope public opinion improves? The problem is that cynical political calculation directly contradicts everything Labor said about integrity, respecting democracy, and being different from the Conservatives. You can't campaign on integrity and then cancel elections when they become inconvenient. Nigel Farage jumping on this is predictable but also tactically smart. Reform UK launching a judicial review positions them as champions of democratic rights, which is excellent branding for a party trying to build credibility as a serious political force rather than just a protest vote. Their lawyers are accusing Steve Reed, the community secretary, of abuse of power, and arguing that the 2000 Act doesn't actually give him the authority to delay election years due to reorganizations. Whether the judicial review succeeds legally is almost beside the point politically. It keeps the story alive, puts Labor on the defensive, and allows Reform to campaign on the message that the establishment parties will literally cancel democracy rather than face voters. What makes the situation even more delicious from a political drama perspective is the internal Labor dissent. Jim McMahon, the former local government minister, publicly criticized plans to delay mayoral elections, saying his own government needed to be better. When your own former minister is openly slamming policy decisions, that's not just opposition noise, that's genuine internal fracture. McMahon clearly thinks this crosses a line, and he's willing to say so publicly despite the inevitable backlash from party leadership. That takes either principle or calculation that distancing himself from this disaster is politically necessary. Again, probably both. Kim Taylor's comments are even more revealing because she's a Labor councillor experiencing this mess firsthand. She says she's angry at the government for putting councillors in the position of having to decide on delaying elections. Her description of being torn and plagued with guilt, having to choose between democracy and smooth transitions, shows the impossible position Labor's created. Councillors who actually care about democratic principles are being forced to either defend the indefensible or publicly break with their own government. It's a lose-lose situation that could have easily been avoided by just holding the bloody elections and letting voters decide. The government's defense, relayed through sources close to Steve Reed, is that this is sensible reorganization to free up money for things people care about, like social care and fixing potholes, which is such obvious spin it's almost insulting. Nobody's arguing against efficient local government or better services. The argument is about whether you cancel democracy to achieve administrative convenience. The answer should obviously be no, but here we are. The suggestion that opposition parties are just scoring political points and the real victims will be taxpayers whose money gets spent on unnecessary elections is genuinely offensive. Elections aren't unnecessary. They're the fundamental mechanism of democratic accountability. Calling them a waste of money reveals an attitude towards democracy that should terrify anyone who cares about political freedom. Let's talk about the timing, because it's absolutely crucial to understanding why this is so toxic. Labor won a landslide just months ago on promises of restoring integrity, competence, and trust in politics. They positioned themselves as the antidote to conservative chaos and dishonesty. And now, facing terrible polling and the prospect of electoral punishment, they're canceling elections. The hypocrisy is so blatant it's almost impressive. If the Conservatives had done this, Labor would be screaming about democratic backsliding and authoritarian tendencies. There'd be emergency debates, impassioned speeches about defending British democracy, demands for resignations. But when it's your own side doing it, suddenly it's just sensible administration. The political calculation here is presumably that most voters won't notice or care about local elections being canceled. Local politics has lower engagement than national stuff. Turnout's generally terrible anyway, and maybe Labor thinks they can weather the criticism from political nerds and opposition parties without serious electoral damage. But that's missing the point entirely. Democracy isn't just about what's electorally convenient or what focus groups say people care about. It's about principle and precedent. Once you establish that governments can cancel elections when polling looks bad, you've opened the door that's very difficult to close. Future governments will point to this precedent and push even further. There's also the practical democratic argument that voters in affected areas are being treated as second-class citizens. If you live in an area where elections are going ahead, you get your democratic say. If you live somewhere Labor's decided to cancel them, tough luck. Democracy will resume when it's convenient for us. That's not equal treatment under the law. That's arbitrary exercise of power based on administrative convenience and political calculation. Some citizens get to vote, others don't, determined not by any consistent principle, but by which council happens to be undergoing reorganization. The 7-year term issue is particularly egregious because it's so far outside normal democratic practice. Parliamentary terms are 5 years maximum. Most elected positions have regular accountability mechanisms built in. 7 years without facing voters is entering autocratic territory. Yes, these are local councillors, not national leaders, but the principle is the same. Regular elections aren't just about changing representatives when they do badly. They're about forcing everyone to periodically justify their position to voters, to be responsive to public opinion, to remember they serve at the electorate's pleasure, not as a right. What's fascinating is how this fits into the broader pattern of Labour's governance so far. Every difficult situation, they seem to choose the option that looks weak, unprincipled, and politically convenient rather than standing on values. Winter fuel payments, farmers' inheritance tax, digital IDs, jury trials, now canceling elections. There's no consistent thread except do whatever causes least immediate hassle and hope the fallout isn't too bad. That's not governing with conviction, that's crisis